Welcome to another enlightening episode of Untethering Shame, the podcast where we unravel the tangled web of shame to ignite the flames of empowerment and liberation. I'm your host, Kira Wackett, and today we're embarking on a profound exploration of shame, activism, and oppression. Joining me is Dr. Rose Aslan, a beacon of wisdom and empowerment who wears many hats as a transformational life coach, writer, educator, academic, community organizer, and breathwork facilitator. Based in Istanbul and a single mother, Rose made the courageous decision to step away from her position as a tenured associate professor of global Islam and religion in 2022, dedicating her life to supporting women in breaking free from the shackles of stagnation and finding joy, balance, and self-awareness. In this thought-provoking conversation, Rose and I will delve deep into the insidious intersection of shame, activism, and oppression, exploring how these forces intertwine to perpetuate systems of oppression and uphold patriarchal structures of power. We'll dissect the notion of hate and bias as a systemic mechanism that thrives on putting others down, fueling the cycles of shame and marginalization that plague our society. Look, people are people. We're not just the color of our skin, our biological sex, our identified gender, religion, or socioeconomic status. But we lose sight of that when fear, greed, and power dynamics come to the table, and we have to figure out how to make our way back. So join us as Dr. Rose and I make space to connect on this important topic, uncovering the seeds of empowerment and resilience that lie beneath the surface. It's time to untether ourselves from the chains of shame and step into a future of compassion, understanding, and connection. Welcome, Rose. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you. It's a true pleasure.
So tell me a little bit about, we were chatting offline. You are having some warm weather that's coming in right now. And so I always think about the effect that that has. Cold weather, like transitioning. I mean, you were in California for a while. And so I'm in the Pacific Northwest. Like when the cold hits, I feel like it changes my mental health a little bit, like my emotional state. When the warm weather hits, it does that. And so I love to kind of anchor every episode in the beginning, just doing a one-word check-in. And I'm curious for you, what's one word that you would use to describe just how you're feeling right now based on the warmth, this episode, whatever's coming up for you?
The moment the word expansive is coming to me, which is interesting because I use one-word check-ins quite often, but the word of my year is expand, but I've never used expansive. So it's actually quite nice that it's the word that I resonate with right now.
Yeah. And that's what's coming to the surface. Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah. And it's also because I just returned from a trip to southern Spain a couple of days ago, and it was so delicious and delightful. And I'm still on that high of that experience.
Had you been there before?
I have a long time ago, just for a quick trip, but I was on 2 different retreats and with these beautiful groups of people and in nature. And it was just magical. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Which makes sense then that if you're doing these things that are putting you in that place and likely sort of helping you with that alignment to the self, to your focus, that word is kind of allowing itself to come to the surface for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think a lot about, for me right now, I don't know. We've had this, I'm sure you see this with people that you work with and in your own life, like how our brain, you have to be so careful because when something happens that doesn't go right, your brain automatically gets triggered to mine for everything else that's not going right. And so it's so easy for our story to become the world is happening to me if we're not careful, and which makes sense. And for some contexts and circumstances, we can see that absolutely feels true. And on an objective scale, it even looks true. But I noticed that recently we've just had all these little things. Like I didn't know that there was such a thing as a vole and moles, but we have voles and moles that are wreaking havoc on our property. And the voles are weakening I literally stepped onto the ground. I was like, are we in, what's that called? Where literally a sinkhole. I'm like, oh my gosh, our house is going to fall in a sinkhole. Turns out, no, but it's these tiny little critters. And then with moles, you have to buy these traps or pay thousands of dollars to hope somebody else catches them. So we've been putting these traps up. I'm trying to catch these. And then this morning I saw something downstairs and I was like, oh my goodness, there's water, which means likely our water heater is starting to rust through a little bit, which is great. I saw it. Like they're coming tomorrow. I'm going to get a new water heater, but like all those little things. So this morning, I think I'm feeling this sense of like, I don't even know how to put it into words, but like my brain is starting to run, but I'm like sort of trying to chain it back to the present moment and to realize I'm okay. Like everything that is happening, like my husband the other day is like, what's the worst that happens if the moles and voles like tear up the back of our property? Because we haven't even started to work on that part of our property yet. He's like, gosh, this looks like good timing to me. Like we haven't done anything back there. They're not rooting anything that like we've done, you know, or like with the water heater, like they're coming. But I think my brain, maybe my word is just like mindful, because I'm aware that my brain is wanting to go down that rabbit hole right now. And I'm trying really hard to not let it do that. Yeah.
I hear you. And for me, during certain times of the month as a woman at the end of my cycle, the world is against me and everything is bad, you know? And no matter, even when the good things are happening, my brain is telling me that everything is terrible. It sucks and everyone hates me. And
And it's interesting, even in those realms, when we know it's a cycle, like I can predict it's going to happen roughly every 4 weeks. I'm going to feel this way. And yet every single month, I still find myself immersed in it and have to be externally pulled out of it. Usually by like my husband kind of laughing and being like, this doesn't match the circumstances of our life right now. Like this seems too much. Like, cause usually I'll get mean. Like, I'm just like, the world is against me. And then I'm kind of a dick to him. And then he'll just kind of look at me like, huh. And I think he puts it together. And then I'm like, oh, dang it. It happened again. And you have to just not feel shame about it. Like I'm not trying to be hurtful, and realize like all I can do is to keep trying to learn, and also recognize that like hormones, chemicals, everything in our body is really powerful. And so sometimes I even think about it in that realm of we have such high expectations of performance of ourselves and how everything is going to go. And I was talking to somebody yesterday about testing out we do these weightlifting classes together, and he's talking about 1 rep maxes. And he's like, for somebody to achieve a true 1 rep max, and then the next time they do it to actually excel beyond it, all of your circumstances have to be just so. Like you could have been doing everything for months in your training, following every single protocol, really working on your skill. And then the night before you get 1 hour less sleep than normal, or you have just like this discomfort like us. We were talking about the heat coming in. Maybe you don't sleep as well. And he's like, and everything is going to be off. But we don't give ourselves credit to all the things that are changing all the time. And I think that's such a true statement for us to think about in the context of all of our work and all of these things. Even when we are going to get into this topic, like I feel that within myself and with people around me, like, oh my gosh, this is a big problem. We have to fix it all now. We have to check off every box, and we got to racism. It's a thing. Let's either there's the opposite route. It's not real. You're making this up, or so we have to fix it right now. What are all the things that we can do? And it's like, that's just not how things work. Like our views, the way that we engage, the way we show up, the way that we live our lives is constantly in this state of ebb and flow. And even the way that our biases show up looks different based on different contexts and circumstances. And so just a reminder that I think things are harder than we want them to be. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing if we learn to lean into that a little bit.
I agree.
Okay. So thinking about this conversation, you know, I'm aware that we could talk for probably 10 hours and still only scratch the surface on this. And so I really want to be centering on the notion that at the core, and we talked about this before we even started recording, like at the core, both you and I, our goal is helping people recognize that people are people. And this idea of sort of reducing people to one aspect of their identity, or even a small subset of their identities, or making a system and designing a system around the way that we treat different people based on their identities isn't okay. And so if we just accomplish that, that's the goal of what we're talking about, I think we've already gotten there. But I'm curious for you, because this topic feels so big and you've dedicated a significant part of your life to talking about this, to doing this work. When you go back to your early childhood and you think about your first instincts and awareness that the world isn't equal, that people are treated differently. Can you think of a time that started to become apparent for you?
Yeah. So you had asked me this question right before, and I was like, I don't have many memories of my childhood period, just for various reasons, PTSD, but I was trying to remember of like something because I just don't remember much. I am lucky that I grew up in a very diverse city of San Francisco. So I had a really amazing experience, and I grew up with parents who were very socially aware. But of course, there was difference. I can't remember specifically something happening when I was young, but one thing that really stands out was maybe in middle school. I was very much into politics and to global issues, and I later became an activist. And I remember reading. I used to go back. Remember back in the old days, we had newspapers in the back of the newspaper. Somewhere towards the back was like the world news section. I don't remember. Not in the beginning. It was American news, right? But somewhere in the back is like a few, like one small page of global news. And I remember seeing an article about child slave labor. Children doing slave labor in Bangladesh, maybe. I can't remember exactly. And it was an article, and it was a photo of this boy, young boy. I think he was about my age exactly. And he was on a loom weaving some kind of textile that obviously they shipped to the United States. And the article was talking about their living standards, how much they're being paid, what his life was like. And it was a very close up about this boy's life. And that struck me so much. It struck me so much. I wrote an essay about it when I was like 11 years old. I submitted to a contest, but it like hit me because, I grew up in a city where kids don't usually work. In the United States, at 11 years old, we're allowed to be children, and we're very lucky that we're allowed to be children. But reading about a child and knowing that so many children in other countries had to work all day and be paid peanuts, and they weren't allowed to go to school, that just hit me. And the fact that as an American child, I was benefiting from the slave labor of these children, it just made me feel so angry and frustrated. And I knew there was something wrong with the system. I didn't know what it was exactly. I was too young, but I actually wrote the essay for the United Nations, some kind of local contest, And I was like, at that point, I thought, UN and those kind of organizations can actually do some good in the world.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, I think about every time similar to you, there's a lot of my childhood I don't remember. And that's obviously my brain that's done some protective work so that I don't re-experience the trauma. But it also has taken me away from all the other experiences too. So there are these kind of moments, but I remember those periods briefly. And I think more of them probably are around that same time, like middle school and even into high school. And you just start to have like the layers lifted over your eyes and you see the world differently. And I think there's this anger. There's also this weird thing that happens. I don't know if this ever happened to you or if you've experienced it with other people, but there's this like, I think because it's so uncomfortable, your brain tries to distance from it. Either the idea that it's not real, or you kind of like go on with your day and you kind of forget that that's happening. There's the convenience factor, especially then, because it wasn't in your face all the time. We weren't like seeing it constantly on Instagram or TikTok or whatever else. And so there's this weird embracing it, but also turning away. And that's this very weird tension. I even think about, I used to get so angry when I still get angry about it. It doesn't happen as much, but growing up, the sort of notion of people being told, well, finish your plate. There's starving kids in Africa. And I remember being like, what the fuck does me finishing my plate have anything to do with the fact that these people still don't have food? Like this, it didn't make sense to me. It was trying to bring two things together, but it was like, is this their way of saying, well, if I'm not wasting food here, it's helping children in Africa to be able to be okay? And so there's some sense of, I don't know, duality in my experience with those situations where I both want to turn and lean into them, but then my brain is so overwhelmed by it, it almost tries to turn away from it so that I can continue to take a step forward in my life. And I don't know if that's just everybody's brain, if that's a sense of dismissal, but that felt really real to me then. And I think there's probably times I'm still doing that now in my everyday life.
I mean, I think it's how humans cope right now, because right now, myself and most people in my world are closely observing the ongoing genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And we can't watch every moment, like we check in because we're witnessy. We need to hold space and show our solidarity to share things, but it's impossible to always be plugged in. And I just went on a retreat in Spain, and then when I talk about that, I feel guilty because at the same time, there's ongoing invasion of Rafah, by the Israeli army. So it's like, I still don't know how. I don't have an answer to how to hold both those things at the same time, right? It's something I struggle with, and every human struggles with. I meet people who have different coping mechanisms, right? I met a number of Palestinians on my trip, and most of them decided to disengage from the media because it wasn't helping them, and it made them suffer further, right? So they prefer to not know the details of what's going on, right? Other people need to be plugged in every moment, to be watching everything that's going on, to spreading the post online and things like that. And other people choose different methods that make them feel like they're doing enough, but it never feels like it's enough, right? Because there's not much we as non-politicians who are not very wealthy, there's not much we can actually do, except, if you're a person of faith. Muslims, for example, talk about prayer is the most powerful tool we have when we have no other power. Yeah,
but I think you're right. It's this interesting piece of, on a smaller scale, I go back to clients around voting and thinking about what happened when Trump was trying to be reelected, and the panic and the experience that I had with some of my clients and the conversations around, and being in a position to say, I think we might have to take a break from social media. We might need to stop reading the news. It feels like we are creating a vigilance in your brain that we're mining for threats right now. And it doesn't feel like it is serving you. Exactly. It feels harder for me to say that, I think, to people with what's going on now, particularly not being in that shared identity and space. And I've struggled even with, I didn't find out, all I know based on what 23andMe told me when I was pregnant with my daughter is that I am Middle Eastern, but I don't know. And I'm 50-ish%. It was like 51 point something. I'm like, well, I'm aware I don't know who my dad is. Sounds like my dad was somewhere from the Middle East. No. I don't know anything about that. And that even feels uncomfortable to claim now, because it feels like I would try to be getting close to maybe an identity of somebody that's suffering. And I don't know anything about my father's racial and ethnic background, religious backgrounds, anything like that. And so whenever I think about now, when I'm having conversations with people, particularly Palestinian people around me, it feels like there's nothing I can say as a therapist where I might offer that to someone else of, what if we took a break? What if we did this? Because it feels like it would be so dismissive to this painful situation, almost like just sweeping it under the rug. Like, well, but you're not there. Yeah. So you should probably stop looking and kind of move on with your day. And that's not the intent, but I could imagine that would be how it's received when it feels like the world in your immediacy, particularly being here in the US, it's like, well, everybody else is sort of functioning and going about their day, and people were sharing a lot more than they are now. And that's sort of natural inclination, human nature. People have kind of integrated as like, oh, this is a norm and my day to day is okay. So here we are. And so it feels like a really weird place to be for anybody that is trying to experience and move through their pain, and or support somebody, or be aware that there are a lot of people moving through pain, and just like being a human, realizing there are people being murdered and tortured for no reason. Like, just on that baseline level, like how do we create space for that? And it feels like a no-win. Like there is no right answer for any of us.
Yeah, exactly. There is no right answer, and we all have to find our own way. And even when I talk about this, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm centering myself. How do I make sure I'm centering Palestinian voices more, right? Every time I'm like, my feelings don't matter that much in this context. I'm not Palestinian. I might be Muslim, but I live in a place that's safe. I don't have bombs falling on me, so do my feelings matter? I'm like, they do. I matter. But then, and I go back and forth with friends and people I work with. And I don't know I don't have a solution, and I'm okay saying I don't, because some people want to give everyone online is like, here's what you do, here's how you work through it. And I don't have an easy hack. I think sitting with these complicated feelings is the best we can do, and being witnessed by someone else.
Yeah. And I think what you said that's so interesting is the idea of kind of going back to like my thing in the beginning, where if I'm not careful, I watch that my brain will just mine for these things. And I think when we have these conversations, if we're not careful, our ego will center us in the conversation because it doesn't know how else to do it. And so it is our individual pain, our experience, our grief, our discomfort, whatever it is, instead of recognizing, no, there is something bigger. And I think the hard part is, for many of us, that idea has been used to silence us in the past. I think about being a kid, when someone's crying and they're upset. And I have a friend who's like, well, when I was little, if I was upset about something, their dad was so against them crying, having any sort of negative emotion. They'd be like, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. And so the idea that like, whatever you're going through isn't that bad, get over it, move on.
Exactly.
Or again, this sort of comparison piece of like, you think your life is hard. There's these people over here that are struggling even more. So there's a way that comparative suffering has been used to dismiss people's experiences. And on the flip side, it's also important to sort of center our suffering in the overall scope of realizing we do have our right to our grief and our pain and our discomfort or whatever, our anger about what's going on, and recognizing sort of the degree, I think of it, maybe the impact that it's having. Like there are people who the impact is much more direct and overt, and needing to recognize that is there and to not take that away. But it does feel like it's that, again, sort of like at both sides. How do we do that and give people the space to their grief while still centering it in the area and the zones that we really need to be anchoring our efforts and our energy? So I'm curious because, it's very apparent, even as you sort of talked about reading that world news section, your brain is very programmed to say, I see this injustice and it causes this reaction in me, and I want to try to use my voice to bring awareness to what's going on. So this is happening, we'll say middle school, probably before. There's probably instances, if we were to really sit and mine for it, that are coming up. You continued down this route. You really decided that activism, using your voice, was really important to you. You ended up pursuing a career in academics where you're teaching in the US about Islam and religion and these things that, like, if anybody doesn't live in the US and they're listening, there's a lot of hate. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of judgments. There's a lot of different areas and problem zones. If we think about anything related to those topics in the United States, and if we think about oppression from that standpoint. And so I'm curious, how'd you go from this UN article, I want to, bring some awareness that this kid deserves something different and that children deserve to be children, up to I'm going to pursue something where I'm stepping into a place where I'm going to be challenged. I'm going to feel othered. I'm going to work in a system and an institution that I know is still perpetuating these things, even if they're not conscious of it. And I'm going to try to use my voice with people that maybe aren't even willing or interested in listening. They're just fulfilling their ethnic studies course.
Or religion requirement.
How did you make that choice? Yeah, right. Or their religious requirement that they have to take. How did you end up there? And what was your driving motivation to be in that space and to use your voice in that way?
Wow, that's a complicated question. Let's start from the beginning and see where we get to from there. Because that's like a lot of history
like 10
there.
questions in one.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So let's see where we can start. So there I was, I was in the president of the Activist Club in high school. And I'm the kind of person who hates injustice. I don't hate a lot of things. I don't use the word hate liberally, but I hate injustice. And I don't like when people's rights are taken from them. I don't like when my rights are taken from me. I believe in justice and fairness for everyone. I believe in human rights. So I had that kind of upbringing and I used to volunteer at the soup kitchen and spend a lot of time doing that sort of work. So when I was in college, I started saying Arabic, and I was going to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict on my own because I was an optimistic young person, right? I was like, I'm going to say the language. I'm going to like somehow help. And it was so naive, you know, and of course, when we're that age, we're very young and very naive. And we know now I know now at my age that I couldn't have done much, especially as an outsider. And it wasn't my role to do so. But I thought I could make a difference. So I really went into studying Arabic partly out of my interest in that part of the world. I had been traveling in Turkey and Iran. Then I went to my third year of university in Egypt. I must admit that at that time, I would call myself an Orientalist, and I maybe am like post-recovering Orientalist, right? I became Muslim when I was in Egypt. I was attracted to the exoticism of that part of the world. I grew tired of the United States. I was taught about certain ideology and idealism of the United States of equality and justice for all and liberty. And I never saw it. And it made me so pissed off that I went to Canada for undergraduate. I was like, I'm done with this country. And I went to Canada, right? And then I went to Egypt and I was like, wow, this world is so different. And so I moved to that part of the world, you know, Egypt, as a way to like rebel against that Americanness within me. I must say, I was trying to figure out as a young, naive, optimistic, social justice oriented person, how do I discard the ugliness of my Americanness that just really disturbed me, because there's idealism and there's reality. And I saw so much inequality within the country and so much injustice. And I was mad about it. So in some way, you can say I went native, you know, and I ended up marrying an Egyptian. And I really was an Orientalist at that time. I admit it. And it's embarrassing and shameful to think of myself and call myself that, but I will. I'd like to think I'm no longer one. But at that time, you know, when I became Muslim, I started out more in a zealot way. You know, I was very excited about it. I was very idealistic about being a Muslim and Islam. So I ended up doing my master's in Egypt. So I stayed there 5 years and studied. My master's was in Arabic and Islamic studies. And I was spending time studying Sufism, which is mystical traditions of Islam. So I started to grow distant from social justice work just because I got into mystical Islam and mysticism and in the context of Sufism. And so then I got pulled into that direction, the scholarly study of mystical Islam, basically. I don't know why exactly, but I also ended up marrying a man who I was married to for a long time. And he turned out to be very controlling and very abusive. And I'm very glad not to be married to him anymore. But I also wasn't able to be myself during those years. So the things I studied, I was very interested in, but I don't know what decisions I would have made in my life had I been on my own, right? Not with him, because I met him when I was very young. At that point, I wanted to pursue the study of Islam academically because I want to spread awareness about Muslims. I saw that people in the US and elsewhere, this was very soon after I was third year abroad. I went there in 2002, right? So right after 9/11. So I saw the misinformation being spread about Muslims in the West. And obviously I hated that as well. Yeah. So maybe one of the reasons I went in that path was like, okay, like I'm from the West, but I'm also Muslim. I can help in bringing some more knowledge to people in the West. Yeah. So my agenda shifted in that way. I was like, okay, it could be my mission. I'm fluent in Arabic. I'm becoming knowledgeable in Islam. So I returned to the U.S. for my PhD in Islamic religious studies, and it was a secular university. It was not a place where you studied to be a Muslim theologian, but it was a place where I got trained in classical Islamic text and theory and understanding of how to talk about Islam to non-Muslims. I specifically went to that university because there's two professors there that I worked closely with who were at that time some of the leading academics speaking to a public-facing audience. Whereas at that time, most academics didn't know how to speak to public audience. These two did. And I was like, I know I want to speak to people in English, not an academic language.
Right. Well, because you're trying to create that change, those ripples. Yeah,
exactly. So it was my mission to go there, get a PhD, and then really be an anti-Islamophobia activist, I guess you can say. That was one of my goals.
And using your platform as an educator to do that, ultimately recognizing that now that I have this level, again, because you're from the US, you recognize that like doors open, the more letters you have after your name, the more that's behind you. And so you recognize I now have this it's hard to want to call it a privilege because you've worked your butt off to get there. And like, you're aware that there is a privilege in the sense that doors will open now. So now I'm going to use that as a way to make people listen in that sense and to hear things and not.
That's exactly why I got the PhD. Like, so I was like, when I get that, people will actually listen to me and won't just disregard me as another whatever,
Right.
So it really did in some ways open up doors. People do give you more respect sometimes. There's still gendered issues and other issues. When you have that PhD behind your name, it does lend you more legitimacy, especially when I had institutional affiliation. Now it's a little bit more different. Now that I have a PhD behind my name, but I don't have institutional affiliation, my standing has changed a lot.
Oh, that's interesting. And you brought up another point too of there are still elements, like the door was open to you when those letters were after your name, but then there's the idea of, are you with a certain institution or are you not? What happens in that context? Also, I'm assuming, because you brought up gender, like there are still these doors that you saw only partially opened, or like you could see through the screen, but the door wasn't actually open to you yet. And so you see that, and I'm assuming at this point, you already had this awareness, but you saw it playing out of, it's never as specific as one identity that you're in or out, because there were all these layers of, are you going to be listened to being a woman? Are you going to be listened to whether or not you have a PhD? Are you going to be listened to whether you have X, Y, and Z? And so it feels like for many people, there's sort of this like clawing to get to a point where they have validity to be heard, which is just a way that the system, I think, continues to perpetuate. I've even seen this as when I apply for speaking events, people will say on there, how many followers do you have? How many followers on TikTok? How many followers on Instagram? How many email list subscribers? And it's really infuriating to me because, and the example that I used in a recent video that I made was that, at the time I was recording, I think Trump had like 84 point something billion or million followers. And I was like, but I definitely think there are things that I have to say that have much more of a collective benefit than this person. And I have none followers on, Twitter or X, whatever it's called now, because I don't use this platform. But what we're saying is that numbers, and I think that it's the same with letters after the name. It's the same with the check marks of identities. It's you have more of a standing and more of a voice. Now, do I agree that a medical doctor probably has more that they should say about, I don't know, some major surgery than somebody who read a Wikipedia article? Yeah, absolutely. I do think there's some balance there, but I think we've sort of scaled someone's right to be heard, particularly when it comes to human rights and social justice based on these things. And I think that is a way that the system continues to play into itself to keep people stuck and to keep the mindset still being in favor of the majority.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a lot of layers to that comment you made about legitimacy behind labels. I'm just thinking about Gaza again. I can't get off my mind, but thinking of these young people in their 20s, like Muataz, who was able to leave Azayaz and Bisan and all these other very young people who became photojournalists and journalists through Instagram and Facebook and other social media sources because they're there and they have phones. And many journals have been killed and other journals aren't allowed in. And these young people, despite having no credentials, are showing the world what's happening, right? And it's powerful. Like, it's actually powerful in social media to have this connection to these people to see what's happening.
Right.
But then if someone has a PhD in whatever and they start making commentary, they will get the op-ed from CNN, even if they actually don't know what's going on, they have no connection with Palestinians, they will still get that privilege.
Right.
For me, the issue is I was like going between different worlds as an academic, so I would go between, I was teaching at a Lutheran university, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. It was called California Lutheran University, but it's a very liberal denomination of Christianity. So there I was as a Muslim teaching Islam at a very liberal university. I really enjoyed being at a liberal leaning university, but then I go to the Muslim community. Okay. I was treated so differently. So there I was in my department full of, some of my colleagues were trained in theology, not religious studies. I was trained in religious studies. Some of them are ordained in various denominations of Protestant Christianity. I would go to chapel. I even gave a couple of sermons at the chapel services at the university. But then I go to the mosque. They would call me Sister Rose. They don't usually give me the title. I would say, hey, can I teach a course? Here's some of the courses I'd like to teach. And what about teach a course about Sufism or something, verging on theology? No. The course they allowed me to teach was History of Muslims in America. Why? Because it's history. But for a Muslim woman to teach theology, to teach kind of how Muslims can practice spirituality was at that time a little too controversial for that mosque. But they would have someone who has like a BA or MA, but he's a man, but less actual credentials in terms of and qualifications. He'd be at the front giving a talk. And occasionally I even had to correct him because he would just say factually incorrect information.
Wow.
And I couldn't help it because I was like, you have to at least be accurate
get it right.
in what you're saying. Yeah, get it right. So it was very hard. And at a mosque, at mosque in the United States or anywhere really, I'll go to a mosque and I have to be at the back. The mosque I went to, there was no screen, no background, but we're in the back of the room as women. In some mosques, you'll be in a different room, in a different building. In fact, the mosque near my university was a very conservative, traditional one. And on Friday prayers, it got very crowded. So women would go to a different building and we can just see the imam, the leader on the screen. Right. And there it was, the local professor of Islamic studies with a PhD having to sit in a different room to watch some guy with not many credentials give some sermon that was actually pretty bad. And then I would go to chapel service and watch my Jewish rabbi friend and my Lutheran and Methodist female friends giving sermons. I gave sermons and knowing that it would never happen within my tradition. That was so interesting to go between those two worlds in the same day, even. It was hard. It's still hard. It still exists. It's still a problem. In fact, I live now in Turkey and I even have less of a standing because even the social capital I built up in the United States, I don't have anymore. Right. So I'm just another person here.
Wow. I think when you were sharing originally, your sort of you in your 20s versus you now, there's that, I can do anything. And then as we get older, it's, I can't do anything. Like, what power do I have? And I think the goal is to find the balance between that of the willingness to believe we can do anything, but also in the context of recognizing our role and sort of the importance of the collective as opposed to like us, the hero. But you pointed out the difference in terms of, I think about it like a company where it's whether or not your mission statement says it versus if you're practicing it are two very different things. I was just having a conversation about psychological safety in the workplace for a large company. And the conversation we had is that diversity is not the same as inclusion, and that diversity has to do with your statistics. The actual inclusive practices and principles are very different. And so I think about, you witness this from just watching the way that people engage in the US and sort of the idea of, well, I go to church on Sundays, so I'm good. And like the idea of the disconnect between the mission statement, the ideals, we still see it today. We were this very, everybody has a place and everybody can make it here, but like not really. And you watch that. And then you had this completely other aspect of yourself. Like you said, whether you would go in the Muslim community or you would be at the school or with other people, you would also see how the systems are at play. It was just a different driving force or system. Like, I think we still see any sort of gender oppression played into within the US, but it's a little bit less overt than I think race and ethnicity and religion, honestly. But then you saw the sort of oppressive system of gender. And so how really at least what I'm seeing, and I don't know if this felt like it was true for you, it feels like different community, same problems, just from whatever scale they're using. Like in that case, it had a lot to do with gender. And then here we're seeing, particularly like your experience had a lot more to do with race, ethnicity, all these other elements, where it was a little bit more overt in that context. And so I could imagine internally, it's like, where do I fit as an equal standing? And what does that look like? And how do I then use my voice? And my guess, because you left the academic world and you made a shift, is that the impression of going into the mosques, the impression of going into those communities and seeing the way that women, purely for being women, were dismissed, had some sort of spark or motivation for you to say, I wonder if I could have more impact, or if it aligns more with me to go and work with women there, to know I don't know, is it that they deserve to be seen?
Yeah.
I want them to feel less like how I felt in that room.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. It's also a layered answer, I think, because when I think about what led to my burnout in my job and why I left, there's a lot of multiple things. I was experiencing bullying by a male colleague, and it was really difficult, and administration was not supporting me in the way I needed. So I felt alone and really difficult and not safe in my own, space. So that was difficult. I was teaching during the Republican primary elections, and then Trump's, victory, and then his presidency. And every day, we had an important section about media bias analysis, because I felt it was my duty, like literally my duty, to teach my students about how to be discerning when they consume the media, social media, TV, newspaper, etc., because they all come from different bubbles. It was a private university, and they were quite sheltered. And most of them just would usually watch the news or whatever and follow whatever their parents followed. And I realized that they didn't know how to read the news, and they thought that if the news said something, it's real, it's fact. And so I taught them how to discern and how to realize that we would look at one current event, and they'd realize that different newspapers or online sources would talk about it differently with different facts based on their agendas, political and otherwise, right? And they're like, oh, wow, you can't just immediately trust any news source. Right? We have to be very skeptical, very discerning. We have to think for ourselves. So I was teaching them critical thinking. But let me tell you, doing that during the Republican primaries, remember when like Ben Carson, oh my God, what other Ted Cruz and all those men were running, and they were literally debating things like, can a Muslim be president? Why or why not? And other questions were like, we need to make sure that we need to establish an internment camps for Muslims. Like, we literally thought this could be a possibility. Like, they're going to put Muslims into internment camps, just like what happened to the Japanese during World War II. So the debates about Muslims and the discussion about Muslims were just horrendous. And then I would have my students do these projects, and it was just like, we all got so mad about this, like what the media was saying, what our politicians were saying about Muslims as well as other oppressed minorities within the United States. And every day thinking about this and talking about this, I was always looking at the news. So you can know what this does to you on a psychological level. If you're always watching the news and analyzing it and doing it as part of your job, it really took a toll. So that took a very strong toll on me. A lot of other things happened in my personal life that led to extreme burnout, but definitely teaching Islam during Trump's presidency. During Obama's presidency was hard enough because it's still post 9/11 in the United States. But during Trump's presidency, to every day, the president said this, but oops, let's actually study the reality, right? But then having students who would kind of question my authority or question me if I was actually offering valid information, and because they were more aligned with the president at that time, things like that. So it was a very difficult time to be a professor of Islam. I gave a lot of talks at churches, synagogues, cultural centers, and I really enjoyed it. But it was so hard, always. And I've spoken about this before, about being a professional Muslim. Like, I wasn't just an ordinary woman. I was a professional Muslim. So instead of just having normal conversations, my identity became always Islam, Muslim, always professor, academic. And I forgot my humanness, I guess you can say. And I was like, talk about this before I talked about anything else. And at that time, I see it now as a bit harmful in how my personal identity was intertwined with my religious and spiritual identity in a way that I couldn't see the end of them. That caused burnout. So because I experienced a very intense burnout numerous times and many existential crises, what happened is that in this path of healing and finding myself, I realized I need to slow down. I need to listen to my body. I need to take care of myself. And along the way, I realized that a lot of other women are experiencing something similar, is that we're not seeing ourselves for who we are in our basic humanness. And we're not taking good care of ourselves. We're not noticing our needs. I was just running on empty for years, not noticing, neglecting my health. Like I didn't notice anything about my body. I didn't notice I had some issues. I had no idea. I was completely disembodied, right? And a lot of women experience this as well. I'm sure men do too, but I specifically focus on women for that reason. And I realized that I couldn't change the world. I couldn't convince all Americans to not hate Muslims. I really just wanted to convince Americans that Muslims are human too. Not all Muslims, most Muslims do not hate Americans. They don't want to kill Americans. They're just ordinary people living their lives with a very, very small percentage of people who have hostile intentions, right? So that I left behind because I realized it wasn't my responsibility anymore. I couldn't do it. I left it to other people. And I decided that what I could do is help women create change in their lives. And I often work with women who are similar to myself, who are helpers, who are making change in their worlds in different ways. So I was realized that if I support people who are helpers, then I can have a different kind of ripple effect, right? And when the helpers are in a better place, when they're kinder to themselves, that can make a bigger difference, especially when their children are feeling more comfortable with them, when their families are more harmonious, right? Their friends. That to me is feeling where my calling is.
Well, it's interesting too, because I think a lot about when you said that you were a professional Muslim and basically losing you in the context of your work. And I think that that is a risk whenever we take something on that feels so personal and that we're so charged with. You see this on any sort of realm of activism is it also, you create this sort of false sense of responsibility. And it's matched with a commitment, a drive, a desire.
Yeah.
But it does become this sort of soul thing, and you take on a burden of responsibility that's disproportional to what you're capable of doing as one human being.
Exactly.
And so then you lose yourself in that chase to do more and more and more and more and more, and recognizing that you can't. And that, I think a lot of the experience is recognizing if anybody doesn't believe that marketing is real, like the root of Islamophobia is in fucking great marketing. Like that is entirely, to me, what I feel like that, like everything when I think of post 9/11, that is entirely rooted in how it was marketed.
100%. There's actually a stealth network of very wealthy donors who anonymously donate to very well-known Islamophobic commentators and politicians who actively market Islamophobia. But there's been people who've done studies on these networks, and it goes back to very wealthy donors who don't want to be known, who literally, like, there's an organization called like the Clarion Institute. You can look them up, and they were created to fund Islamophobia misinformation in the United States. So yeah, their marketing is excellent.
And what you describe with what you would do with your students I think we live in this culture of hustle and chaos and move, which is where I think we got really lost in the mission statement versus the practice. And so the idea of, well, we're just going to keep saying that we're doing all these things, but like, we just have to move faster and keep up. And it became all about winning, whether that was, beating Russia or having the right this or be whatever it is. Like there's this idea of we got to get there fastest and be the best. And in the midst of that, you can't be the best and make sure that everybody feels seen, safe, and heard. Those two things cannot happen. I'm having that conversation with my 4-year-old all the time. She's in that, like, I just want to win stage. I'm like, there's two choices in life. You can work really, really hard and want to do your best and center on being kind to yourself and the rest of the world, or you can focus on being the best. You can't have both. Yeah. Those two things cannot exist, because if you go over here and you choose, I've got to be the best, I've got to be right, it requires you to let go of these other pieces. And I think along the way, we as a culture, many, many, many years before you and I were born, the decision was made to be right and to be the best over being kind. And it's really hard then to come back to that. And then I think for those of us now, there is this, I talked about this. I felt like it was, I don't remember exactly what day it was. Do you remember the day that everybody posted black squares on Instagram in support of Black Lives Matter?
That's happened numerous times, but I don't remember the date.
There was one it was either 2021 or 2022. And I can't remember the specific date, but it was like universal. And I saw all of these people that were posting these black squares on social media. Now I recognize the power, again, of social media and a movement. I also paid attention to how many conversations are being had after the fact. What was the movement? What was the change? Even within the field as a therapist, I feel like there's become such a pressure on all these things we have to say and do that feels like it is anchored to checking the box. Again, diversity versus inclusion. And I've really struggled with those things because there's times I felt the pressure back when I was still on social media of, well, I should put a black box up. And then I had to stop and go, well, one, what am I afraid of if I don't? Because I do believe that racism is a problem and I want to work on it. But I don't think that me posting a black box is doing anything to change my bias. And I don't think that I'm going to have the biggest ripple if I just post that with no words behind it. So what does that actually look like? And then having to pause and take that information and kind of decipher it. Concurrently, I took this course on vaccines. This is when I was still sort of in I think I want to be a physician. And it was the most amazing course because I was always raised pro-vaccination in my home. And I have a lot of close people in my life that were anti-vaccination sort of camp. And then people that were sort of in the middle, like, I don't know. It feels like I don't have all the information. I don't know the right answer. And in this class, every single paper that we wrote like 10 papers over the course of a semester. You had to take a different position every time. So one time when we would write about a certain vaccine or the process like the flu vaccine and how that is done, how they create the next year's vaccine and all those things, you had to take a pro or an anti stance and filter all of your data through that lens. And then the next time you wrote a paper on whatever the topic was, you took the opposite approach. And it was so interesting because by the time I finished that semester, I was like, I don't know where the fuck I stand. Are vaccines right? Are they not? I don't know. I can find the data to support any side. But the gift that gave me was recognizing that everything that I'm consuming is still coming to me through a human lens.
Exactly.
And if I can take that and recognize, I don't know the right answer. I don't know the effect. I don't know. There's no way to fully study it of like whether or not you did post that black square and what effect that can have in terms of, people sharing things now. I know it does something, but I do know that again, going back to that, like when we were little and that I want a distance, but I also want to make a change. I know that I can't do what everyone's telling me to do because that ultimately comes back to me just doing something to feel like I'm doing something good enough. So instead I have to sit with it more and go, okay, what feels right? How do I create a change? I do believe these things are an issue. And I know that I can't in my lifetime undo them. Understanding enough about genetics and bias now, I realize that I can't undo racism, sexism, all the forms of oppression. We're not going to see that undone in our lifetime. So then how do I shift that a little bit? And it sounds like that's in a similar vein where you had to get to, which is I can't continue to try to do it all and be it all and wear this hat all the time. That's not fair to me. Yeah. It's also not fair to the movement because it's not sustainable and I'm not going anywhere with it and I'm burning out. And what is that going to do in 10 years? And so you stepped back and you said, this is still important to me. It's not just about Muslims. It's not just about Islamophobia, but it's about what you said, basic human rights and realizing that people deserve to be seen and treated a certain way. Gosh, this way feels sustainable. This way feels meaningful. And this way feels like it might not be direct. This is me talking about Islamophobia every single day and trying to make sure that everybody understands that that's not okay. And this is marketing and blah, blah, blah. But it is me helping the next person to find and support and maintain and care for their voice, recognizing that maybe then we can have that collective impact in a very different way.
Yes, for sure. That was a really aptly put. I had to reorient myself, as many of us do once we reach a certain age and level of maturity, where you try to find more meaning in a different way.
Yeah. And balancing, I think that idea of I can do it all and I can't do anything. Like it sounds like you found that balance. I can't do it all, but I can do this really well. And
being a single mother really gave me very stark choices. Yeah. I literally couldn't keep on doing that job. It wasn't viable to give my son the time he deserved because he's a child. He deserves me, especially because his father's not in his life. He deserved more of me. And I wasn't able to give him enough. When I was in my job, I was on the screen too much, prepping for class, grading, whatever I was doing. I wasn't giving him the attention he deserves. So I'm happy that our life is slower and I can give him the focus he needs, because my job is also raising this young man who's going to be someone who hopefully makes a little bit of change in his corner of the world. And a little kindness too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know I said it in the beginning that we could talk forever, and I also could just talk to you for so long. And I've just appreciated your willingness to have this conversation and to kind of jump into different pockets and have these things where we can hold space for them. And again, with the idea that we can't fix or solve it all, but even just being willing to have the conversation and sitting in that discomfort is powerful and does create that change. And so I'm curious, because people listening, I think there's going to be sort of two layers happening. So first is going to be, thank you for giving me that invitation to slow down a little bit. That doesn't make me a bad person. That doesn't mean I don't care. I'm not committed. And so I think there are going to be some people that are having this experience of relief, of realizing I've got to figure out how to make this work for me. And it's okay that I factor myself in and figure out how to make that work. The second side, I think, is going to be maybe sort of a realization of, I do want to bring more space to these things. I want to continue to be mindful about how I show up and how do I take more of this discomfort into my life. And so I'm curious if you have anything that you could say to those people around just what that maybe next invitation is for them, so that they don't do what you and I've done in different contexts of going all in or burning out or getting lost in the messaging, but can find a way that it feels authentic to them.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I quit academia and I moved across the world with my son. That's a pretty dramatic move. I don't recommend most people do that, right? When I market my own work and say, hey, you can come work with me, I don't usually tell them moving across the world is going to solve your problem. Right. It helped me, right? But for other people, it can be a lot smaller change and shifts in your life that really helps you find more balance. So I think what most people need is getting to know themselves better, so that they can know what their needs are. Because especially in the North American context, we're so in this grind, the cycle of work, and that's all. Yeah. Like, we can't really get out of this. I was like, work and what?
Period.
And what else? Yeah, work. Yeah. Like, when I speak to my friends, it's interesting because I was in Spain and people were talking about when they go on month-long vacations in the summer. I was like, oh, that's so interesting, because Americans don't have that,
No, we get a weekend. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we feel bad the whole time.
Exactly. And then the Spanish were talking about like their healthcare, and things like that. Like, I literally couldn't have stayed in the United States because I couldn't have afforded healthcare, So I had to leave so I could just have a normal life. But for a lot of people, it starts with making very small shifts, right? For me, coming back to myself and to my body and noticing and observing and being kind to it really helped a lot. And for people I work with who do have very busy lives and aren't going to change that, what they can benefit from is slowing down in the moments they have available to them, right? Is you have to look at your calendar, look at your priorities. And it means sacrificing some things. It means discarding some things from your schedule that aren't necessary because you need time for whatever it is that will help you feel better. So it's about balancing your need to, if it's fight for the rights of people that you believe are being treated unfairly, or if it's supporting people who need your help in your community or taking care of your family, there's always small shifts that you can make to first take care of yourself. Because I learned that when you give from a place of emptiness, it's just not very good quality giving. When you give from a place of abundance, it's just absolutely beautiful, and people receive abundance from you instead of just, so it makes a difference. There's many different techniques and modalities. I'm not the kind of person who believes there's one modality that will solve everything. I have tried so many different healing modalities in my life, and they all worked in different ways. So I think people need to find different modalities that they can stick to. For example, some clients will say, I'm a bad meditator. And I'll just say, then don't meditate, try something else, right? And like, oh, okay, I love dancing. I'm like, well, then find a way that dance can be your way of healing and coming back to your body and yourself. So finding things that you love, that bring you delight, that bring you presence, whatever that might be.
Yeah, it sounds like inviting people to be more curious. And I think recognizing that, there's to be able to have the impact that we want to have in our own lives, whether it's our own goals or dreams, but also when we think about the collective, you have to stop operating from the place of fear of what happens if I don't keep succeeding, moving, being, doing all the time. And that's a really challenging place to be in. I still think about, I would only give myself like a C+ right now. I mean, I used to be an F. So again, we're talking about shifts. I've made the shifts, but at being able to take an hour and not do anything.
Yeah.
I like only now recently can I watch a movie without trying to fold laundry, answer emails, do this other thing, because we have this fear of, well, what happens if I'm not X, Y, and Z? And again, I think that's where that idea, when we go back to large scale change and activism, is we've made it a checklist instead of helping people really integrate it into their value system. And so for some people, the ways that it is kind of laid out really aligns, but not for everybody. So I like what you said about, us sort of choosing and centering in our own bodies and selves can allow us to really integrate into the community in ways that feels meaningful. Because yes, it's not about us, but it also has to fill us up in some way so that we can keep doing it. And if we are just, like you said, giving from an empty cup, you're going to end up resenting and then distancing yourself from that work because it feels like it's too much to take in. And so how do we protect that in the long term? So now I'm curious, because some people are gonna be like, okay, but now you've mentioned clients a few times, which means you do this work with people. And I want to have some more of these conversations. And I think that you would be a great fit for me. Where is the best place for people to go to connect with you in terms of any of their questions or maybe interest in getting to know and maybe working with you?
Yeah, sure. I have a website, compassionflow.com. And then I'm on Instagram and Facebook, Dr. Rose Aslan. And I'm pretty active there. You can find my latest breathwork video I made in Andalusia up there right now.
Oh, cool.
You can find me there. And I have a podcast. I forgot about that. Called Rahma with Rose. And Rahma means compassion in Arabic. And in this podcast, I speak to primarily Muslim-oriented women about their spiritual and healing journeys. And I focus on Muslim women because we don't have a lot of their stories in terms of their spiritual healing story and journeys. We have a lot of stories about Muslim women taking off their hijab, or kind of very stereotypical understanding of Muslim women in the West. I was like, I want to know how they found themselves. How did they get out of difficult situations? How did they walk their spiritual journeys? So I see it as a very unique compilation of Muslim women's voices. And so people are interested in learning more about Muslim women beyond the veil and beyond the stereotypes that you see in the media. This is a way to get a really nuanced understanding of Muslim women one-on-one and what their lives are like from around the world.
Yeah. And I think, just the way that you put information out, again, is for people to just kind of hear and connect. And I think that it's very evident that that is your goal, is to build connection, to build safety, and to allow for everyone to feel like they deserve to be seen, and to create space for others to be seen too. And I think when we get out of that, there's only enough space for some people and only these people are worthy, then we can really do that. And so it's evident in all the things that you take on that that's really at your core.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you see that, because I do that because I never felt seen, or I had a space where I was safe. And so the only way I respond to that is by providing that myself, so that others can at least feel that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of nice too. I feel like I feel like it's been a journey to learn that when I stop worrying about how other people perceive me, and I just act from a place of what feels right to me, what I do want to come through does come through. And so it sounds like the same for you, is when you're able to step back and just like lean into what feels authentic and good to you, your messaging does come through in that way, which I think is really nice. I appreciate this conversation so much. I think that there's so many spaces that my brain, what I like is that we didn't skim the surface. We went below the surface, but we didn't stay in any one place too long, which allowed my brain to kind of notice some pockets of curiosity that I just want to continue to leave open for a while, and to be thinking about, what's happening in Gaza. There's a nurse that just came back to Portland that was there for a while and couldn't get out for like a week. and this experience and sort of what's being highlighted, and her sort of recentering back on other people, not on her. And I've been paying attention to it just sort of as a local story and thinking about, you know, what do I do with these big feelings, and what do I do with my own guilt, and what do I do with some of these things? And like you said, how do we recenter it back on the places and spaces that matter, and really thinking through that. And so bringing some curiosity into how do I continue to make those shifts and how I'm communicating, but then also thinking back to this idea of inclusion on a much more expansive scale, that we don't boil it down to just one identity or one aspect, but thinking about sort of sustainable inclusion building practices and what that looks like. And so I appreciate that you just gave our listeners that space to invite the curiosity when they're ready, and to allow that piece of, we're not saying someone's shitty because they haven't been talking about what's happening right now, or that someone's a terrible person because they haven't been recognizing the ways that their privilege have played into things. That's not at all what we're saying. We're just saying that there's a system that's more complex than many of us realize when we're stuck in the thick of the movement and the pace. And so
exactly,
you gave us that. So I'm really grateful. And I just want to thank you for being here to allow our listeners to receive that.
Yeah, well, thank you for giving this space to myself and others from different kind of backgrounds to be able to voice and share our experiences in this very safe space that you have created here. So I really appreciate you.
You're so welcome. Listeners, with any of these topics, just remind yourself, take what you can, come back, revisit it, but try not to rush to action and feeling like we have to do something, change something, fix something. And also try not to run away from the feelings. Be with whatever came up for you. Notice those things. Again, accept that invitation for curiosity, and you can always come back and take it to another layer more and more deeply as we go. Until then, we will see you next Sunday, and we will dive into another episode and topic then.